There is a moment every night when your entire life becomes programmable, and most people completely waste it without even realizing it. This message is not random. It is arriving at a time when something inside you already feels heavy, stuck, or quietly frustrated with where life is going. Not because you are failing, but because something deeper is repeating itself without your permission. And that repetition is shaping everything you call your reality right now. Right before sleep, your mind does something most people never think about. It stops resisting. It stops arguing. It stops protecting old beliefs. In that quiet state, every thought you allow in becomes instruction. Not opinion, instruction. And those instructions slowly build the world you wake up into. Most people never hear this truth. Not because it is hidden, but because they stop paying attention too soon. There is a deeper system running underneath your daily thoughts. A system that does not care about effort alone. It responds to repetition, emotion, and belief. Especially at night, when your awareness is soft and your guard is down, that system listens more clearly than at any other time. And here is the part that will stay with you. Most people trying to change their financial life, their confidence, their direction, are working during the wrong hours. They push harder in the day, then destroy all of it at night by repeating the same thoughts of lack, worry, and limitation before sleep. And then they wake up confused, wondering why nothing is shifting. It is not that life is refusing to change. It is that something within is being rewritten every single night in the same direction. But before understanding how to change it, stay with this, because what comes next will completely change how you see your mind. There is a hidden reason why certain people seem to shift their financial reality faster. Why opportunities appear for them in ways that feel almost unnatural. It is not luck, it is not background, it is not even timing. It is something far simpler and far more powerful that happens in silence, when the world goes quiet and the mind is most open. Most people will never hear this, not because it is hidden, but because they stopped too soon. And if you are still here, something in you is already different from the version of you that was struggling in silence. What you are about to hear is not just information. It is a reprogramming of how you end your day, how you speak to yourself, and how your reality begins to respond. Before continuing, make sure you are subscribed, because what comes next is not something you want to hear once and forget. It is something you return to until it starts changing the way your life feels from the inside out. There is a reason your financial life feels like it is repeating itself, no matter how much effort you put in. Do not skip this part, because this is where most people quietly misunderstand their entire reality. It is easy to assume that stuck means something is wrong with you, that you are not disciplined enough, not smart enough, not lucky enough. But that assumption is the very thing keeping the cycle alive, because the truth is far more uncomfortable and far more freeing at the same time. Your current money reality is not a punishment, it is a pattern. And that pattern is being generated by something you rarely notice in your daily life, your subconscious instructions. These are not thoughts you choose. They are thoughts that were repeated to you, around you, and within you for years. And now they run automatically, like background software shaping every decision you make without asking for permission. Here is a surprising fact most people never hear. Neuroscientists have observed that the subconscious mind processes information thousands of times faster than conscious thought. And it does not distinguish between past imagination and present reality when forming emotional responses. That means what you repeatedly feel and believe becomes more influential than what you logically want. So even when you are trying to change your situation, another system inside you is still running old commands. Commands like scarcity, delay, fear of loss, doubt before action. And over time, those silent instructions become your visible life. This is why effort alone often feels exhausting. You are not just pushing forward. You are also fighting against an internal script that has not been updated yet. And here is where most people miss the turning point. They think external change creates internal change. But it is the opposite. Your outer world is only reflecting what has already been accepted inside as normal. If money feels stuck, it is not because opportunity is absent. It is because your mind is still repeating an older version of reality where things do not flow easily. And until that script changes, the pattern will continue to recreate itself in slightly different forms, but the same emotional experience. But here is the part that changes everything if you really listen closely. There is a way this script begins to rewrite itself without force, without struggle, and without waiting for life to finally improve first. And what I am about to share next, nobody talks about this, but it changes everything. There is a moment every night when your mind stops behaving like it normally does. And almost nobody realizes when it happens. Do not skip this part, because this is where most people unknowingly lose control of their inner world. Between wakefulness and sleep, something subtle begins to shift. Your thoughts slow down. Your defenses weaken. The constant inner questioning that usually protects your beliefs starts to fade. And in that fading, something far more powerful takes over. You stop analyzing reality and start absorbing it. Here is a lesser-known fact that changes how you understand this state. During the transition into sleep, brain activity moves into a pattern called theta dominance, a frequency range strongly linked with learning, memory integration, and emotional imprinting. In this state, the mind becomes significantly more suggestible, not in a weak sense, but in a deeply receptive one where repetition becomes identity. This is why the final thoughts before sleep often feel heavier than the rest of the day, because they are not just thoughts anymore. They are instructions being filed into the deeper layers of perception, and this is where everything quietly begins to change for most people without them ever noticing. If the last thing you feel before sleep is stress, uncertainty, or lack, that feeling does not stay at the surface. It settles deeper, it becomes familiar. And what becomes familiar eventually becomes normal. But if the last thing you hold is clarity, calmness, or even a simple repeated direction toward abundance, something different begins to form underneath the surface of your awareness. Not instantly, not dramatically, but consistently. This is where identity is rewritten in silence. And here is something most people never consider. You are not just going to sleep each night. You are entering a state where your mind becomes more honest than your conscious self. It stops resisting what it hears. It stops debating what it believes. It simply absorbs. And that is why even small repeated ideas before sleep can slowly reshape how you see money, opportunity, and your own potential. But there is something even deeper happening here that almost nobody talks about. Something that explains why certain thoughts seem to stick while others disappear completely. And what comes next will reveal why most people are unconsciously programming the exact reality they do not want every single night. There is a silent habit most people repeat every night without realizing it is shaping their entire financial reality. Do not skip this part, because this is where most people unknowingly reinforce the very life they are trying to escape. Right before sleep, when the world finally becomes quiet, the mind should be settling. But for most people, it does the opposite. It replays everything they did not fix during the day. The unpaid bills, the missed opportunities, the conversations that went wrong, the fear of what tomorrow might bring. And in that state, the mind is not resting. It is rehearsing. Here is something most people do not know. Studies in cognitive neuroscience suggest that emotional memory consolidation is stronger during pre-sleep periods, meaning the feelings attached to thoughts right before sleep are more likely to be stored and reinforced in long-term memory. In simple terms, the emotional state you fall asleep in becomes easier for your brain to repeat the next day. And yet, this is the exact moment most people use to mentally punish themselves. They relive failure as if replaying it will somehow fix it. They imagine worst-case scenarios as if preparation equals control. They revisit stress as if thinking harder will create solutions. But what is actually happening is far more subtle and far more powerful. They are training their mind to feel familiar with struggle. Here is the uncomfortable truth. You do not just remember what you think before sleep. You absorb it. And over time, your mind begins to treat that emotional pattern as normal. So even when nothing is happening in the outside world, your inner world is already living in the same frequency of worry, lack, or pressure. And then comes the confusion. People wake up and wonder why their financial situation does not change, why opportunities feel distant, why motivation fades so quickly. But the answer is not in the morning. It is in the last few minutes before sleep when no one is paying attention. This is why effort during the day often feels like it disappears overnight. Because the mind resets itself back to the emotional state it was trained to hold in silence. And here is where it becomes even more important, because there is one small shift that completely breaks this cycle. Something simple, almost invisible, but powerful enough to change the direction of your entire internal system. And what I am about to share next, nobody talks about this, but it changes everything. There is something about money that most people misunderstand at the deepest level. And that misunderstanding quietly shapes their entire life. Here is the truth nobody says out loud. You were never broken. You were never lost. You were always exactly where you needed to be. Do not skip this part, because this is where everything you believed about effort and struggle starts to shift. Most people are taught that money responds to hard work alone. Work more, grind more, push more. But if that were fully true, the most exhausted people would be the richest. And reality does not follow that pattern. Something else is always operating underneath effort. Money responds to something far more subtle. Internal alignment. When your internal state is rooted in scarcity, even opportunities feel limited. You hesitate more. You notice problems faster than solutions. You interpret situations through fear without realizing it. And over time, this creates a consistent pattern that looks like not enough, even when effort is present. Here is a lesser-known insight from behavioral psychology. Human decision-making is heavily influenced by emotional priming, meaning the emotional state you hold before and during decisions shapes what options you even notice in the first place. In other words, your internal state does not just affect your actions, it affects your perception of reality itself. And this is where everything begins to split into two directions. When you feel scarcity, even small financial decisions feel heavier. You delay, you doubt, you narrow your thinking without realizing it. But when your internal state shifts toward abundance, something subtle changes. You begin to notice possibilities you previously ignored. You take slightly different actions. You respond differently to opportunities, not because the world changed, but because you did. Your energy is not just emotion, it is instruction. It tells your mind what to look for, what to ignore, and what to believe is possible. And here is what makes this even more powerful. Most people try to change their money reality by forcing external change first, without realizing their internal frequency is still broadcasting limitation. So even when something new appears, they filter it out unconsciously because it does not match their internal instruction set. This is why some people seem to attract better outcomes without constantly forcing effort, while others feel like they are pushing against invisible resistance every single day. But there is a deeper mechanism behind this shift that explains why changing your internal state does not just affect your thoughts, it starts to change your timeline of results. And what comes next will reveal why this shift often begins silently before anything external ever changes. There is a reason certain thoughts in your mind feel stronger than others, even when you try to replace them. Do not skip this part, because this is where you finally understand why change feels so slow, even when you are trying your best. The mind does not transform through single moments of inspiration. It transforms through repetition. Especially repetition tied to emotion. When a thought is repeated often enough in an emotional state, the brain begins to treat it as identity rather than information. And that is where most people unintentionally lock themselves into the same cycle. Here is something rarely explained in simple terms. Neuroscientific research on synaptic plasticity shows that repeated neural firing strengthens specific pathways in the brain, making certain thought patterns easier to access over time. In simple language, whatever you repeat emotionally becomes the path your mind prefers to travel. So when the same thoughts are repeated before sleep, when resistance is lowest and absorption is highest, those thoughts do not just stay as thoughts. They begin to shape automatic identity responses. This is why one strong motivational moment rarely changes a life. But small repeated signals, especially at night, begin to rewire how you see yourself without you realizing it. And here is where it becomes deeply personal. Most people are not stuck because they lack knowledge. They are stuck because they have been repeating the same internal dialogue for years without interruption. Dialogue about not having enough, not being ready, not being capable. And that repetition slowly becomes familiar truth. But repetition works both ways. Even a small shift repeated consistently can begin to overwrite the old pattern. Not instantly, not dramatically, but quietly, in the background of your thinking where identity is formed. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. Intensity creates emotional spikes, but consistency creates identity structure. One moment of belief does not rewire you, but repeated belief, especially before sleep, begins to change how your mind responds automatically to life. And once your automatic responses change, your decisions change. And once your decisions change, your financial direction begins to shift in ways that feel almost unexplainable at first. But there is something even deeper happening underneath repetition that most people never notice. A point where repetition stops being effort and starts becoming identity itself. And what comes next will reveal why most people never reach that point, even when they are doing everything right. There is a point where something subtle begins to change inside you, and at first you do not even realize it is happening. Do not skip this part, because this is where most people miss the moment their life actually starts shifting. At the beginning, it feels like nothing is happening. You are still the same person dealing with the same thoughts, the same pressures, the same uncertainty. But underneath that surface, something quieter is beginning to reorganize itself. Your thoughts start to lose urgency around scarcity. The constant mental noise that once felt automatic begins to slow down slightly. Not because problems disappear, but because your mind is no longer feeding them the same emotional intensity. Here is something most people never hear. Research in cognitive behavioral studies shows that repeated exposure to emotionally neutral or positive self-directed messaging can gradually reduce amygdala reactivity, which is the part of the brain strongly associated with fear-based decision-making. In simple terms, repeated mental input can soften the emotional intensity of fear over time. And that is exactly what begins to happen here. You do not suddenly become someone new. You begin to notice a gap forming between your old reaction and your new awareness. In that gap, something powerful appears: choice. You start noticing opportunities differently, not because the world changed, but because your attention is no longer locked inside survival thinking. Small things that once felt invisible begin to stand out. Ideas feel slightly more possible. Decisions feel slightly less heavy. Fear does not vanish, but it loses authority. And here is where it becomes deeply personal. Your inner dialogue starts to shift in ways you cannot fully control at first. The harsh voice that used to repeat limitation begins to soften. Not fully gone, but interrupted. And in those interruptions, a new tone begins to form. A quieter, more stable sense of direction. This is not imagination. It is repetition changing response. And most people never recognize this stage when it begins because it does not announce itself. There is no dramatic moment, only small internal changes that feel almost too subtle to trust. But those small changes are the beginning of a completely different trajectory. And what happens next is even more important, because this is the phase where most people either break through or unconsciously return to their old pattern without realizing it. And what I am about to share next, nobody talks about this, but it changes everything. There is a phase in every real transformation where nothing on the outside confirms that anything is changing. And this is exactly where most people give up. Do not skip this part, because this is the exact point where your life either quietly shifts or stays exactly the same. At first, everything still looks familiar. The same problems, the same responsibilities, the same financial pressure. And if you judge progress only by external results, it feels like nothing is working at all. But internally, something very different is happening. Your mental wiring is beginning to reorganize itself in the background. Not loudly, not visibly, but structurally, like invisible pathways being cleared and rerouted beneath your awareness. Here is a lesser-known truth from neuroplasticity research. When new thought patterns are introduced consistently, the brain begins to weaken old neural pathways that are not used, while strengthening new ones through a process called synaptic pruning. This does not happen instantly. It happens quietly over time, often without any immediate external confirmation. And that is why this phase feels so uncertain. You are no longer the same person you were mentally, but your external life has not caught up yet. And this delay creates doubt. It creates the illusion that nothing is happening. But in reality, this is the exact stage where change is forming its foundation. Most people quit here, not because nothing is working, but because they cannot see it yet. And this is where something powerful begins to test you. You start to feel a subtle shift in how you respond to old thoughts. The same worries do not land with the same weight. The same fears do not fully control your attention anymore. There is a gap forming between the thought and your reaction to it. That gap is progress. And if you are patient enough to stay in this phase, something very important begins to emerge. A quiet internal stability that does not depend on immediate external validation. But this is also the point where most people unknowingly reset their progress, just before the breakthrough begins to show itself. And what comes next explains exactly why that happens, and how to recognize the moment just before everything finally turns. There is a moment in every real transformation when you stop trying to change your life and start realizing you are the one who is changing. Do not skip this part, because this is where everything you thought about money starts to collapse and rebuild itself in a completely different form. For most of your life, money may have felt like something you had to chase, something outside of you, something unpredictable. Something that requires effort, pressure, and constant pursuit just to keep up with it. But that identity is not fixed, it is learned, and what is learned can be rewritten. Here is something rarely explained clearly. Behavioral identity research shows that human beings do not act according to what they want, but according to who they believe they are. This means every financial decision you make is not just based on logic or opportunity, but on your internal self-definition in that moment. And that is where everything begins to shift. Because in this stage, something subtle changes inside you. You stop making decisions from urgency. You stop reacting from fear of lack. You begin to notice a different internal posture forming. One that feels calmer, more grounded, less desperate to force outcomes. It does not mean problems disappear. It means your relationship with them changes. And here is where it becomes deeply personal. You start to sense that money is not something you run after, but something that responds differently when your internal state changes. Not in a magical way, but in a practical one. Your decisions become less scattered. Your thinking becomes clearer. Your choices become more aligned with long-term direction instead of short-term fear. And slowly, without forcing it, you begin to act like someone who is not in survival mode anymore. Not because your situation fully changed yet, but because your identity is no longer fully attached to struggle. This is the beginning of ownership. Not ownership of money itself, but ownership of your internal state that shapes how money moves in your life. And once this identity starts forming, something very important begins to happen in the background of your reality. A shift that most people do not notice until it is already too late to ignore. And what comes next will reveal the final turning point that separates temporary change from permanent transformation. Everything you have heard in this video was never really about money alone. It was about something deeper, something more silent, something that has been shaping your entire experience of life without you fully noticing it. From the way your mind behaves before sleep, to the emotional patterns you repeat when no one is watching, to the internal identity that quietly decides how you see opportunity, fear, and possibility. It has all been connected. And now it starts to make sense in a different way, because nothing outside of you was ever the real starting point. The real shift has always been internal. If there is one thing to take from all of this, it is this. Your life is not being shaped in the loud moments of effort alone. It is being shaped in the quiet moments of repetition, in the thoughts you allow before sleep, in the identity you keep reinforcing when you think no one is listening. That is where your direction is decided long before results appear. And the powerful part is this. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. You begin to realize that change does not require force as much as it requires awareness, a new way of being, a new internal instruction that slowly replaces the old one, not through pressure, but through repetition. Not through struggle, but through alignment. And maybe for the first time, you are not seeing yourself as stuck, but as someone in transition. Someone in the process of quietly rewriting what they accept as normal. Before you go, read this one last thing carefully. This might be the most important thing in this entire video. The version of you are becoming is not far away. It is already forming in the way you think, in the way you speak to yourself, and in the way you end your day. The only thing left is consistency in that direction. Everything you just heard, you already knew. Deep inside, you just needed someone to remind you. Now let it settle. Do not rush it. Let your mind absorb it naturally, especially before sleep, when it matters the most. If this message resonated with you, then subscribe to this channel, because this is where we continue to explore these deeper shifts that most people ignore but quietly change everything. And if you felt even a small shift while listening, leave a like. Not for the video, but as a reminder to yourself that something inside you has already started changing.